The note was sitting on the kitchen table, propped against the salt shaker like it was nothing more than a grocery list. And that's the detail I couldn't get past for weeks afterward, that she'd used the salt shaker. My name is Michael. I'm 35, and until that Tuesday afternoon in October, I owned and operated West Auto Repair on Route 9 in Millbrook, Ohio, and I'd been married to a woman named Rachel for 12 years. I want to say that clearly, up front, because everything that happened afterward would eventually convince a lot of people in my life that I must have missed something enormous, some obvious rot at the center of things, and the truth is more complicated and more ordinary than that. We were fine. We were the kind of fine that stops registering as anything at all after a decade together, which I've since learned is its own kind of danger. I'd come home early that day because a client had canceled a brake job, and I figured I'd surprise Rachel with takeout from the Thai place she liked, the one across town that she always said was too far to bother with on a weeknight. I remember carrying the bag up the porch steps, keys already in hand, feeling that specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of a small kindness about to land well. The house was quiet in a way that didn't register as wrong at first. Rachel worked part-time at a boutique downtown, and Tuesdays she usually got home around 5, same as me. It was 4:15. I called her name once, twice, set the takeout bag on the counter, and that's when I saw the folded piece of paper against the salt shaker, my name written on the outside in her handwriting, the same round, looping cursive she used on birthday cards. I want to be honest about the several seconds before I opened it. Some old, stubborn part of me constructed an ordinary explanation even as my hands were already unfolding the paper. She'd gone to her sister's for the week. She'd left me a sweet note about dinner, anything. I have never in my life been more wrong about what a piece of paper was about to tell me. Michael, I can't do this anymore. I've been unhappy for a long time, longer than I think either of us wants to admit. I've met someone, and I'm going to be honest with you because you deserve that much. His name is Marcus, and I'm going to be staying with him for now. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Please don't try to call me tonight. I'm sorry. I really am. I read it 4 times standing at that counter before the words actually assembled themselves into something my body understood. 12 years. A handwritten note against a salt shaker, for sentences, an initial instead of a name. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever had an entire decade of your life collapse into something you could hold in one hand, folded twice, you already know that the strangest part isn't the pain. It's the silence afterward, the specific, ringing quiet of a house that used to have 2 people in it. I didn't call her that night. The note asked me not to, and some numb, obedient part of me actually honored that, which tells you something about the kind of husband I'd spent 12 years training myself to be. One who didn't make noise, who didn't chase, who trusted that whatever Rachel needed from a situation, she'd tell me eventually if I just gave her room. I sat at the kitchen table with the Thai food going cold in its plastic bag, and I read the note a 5th time, and I noticed, with a strange, detached clarity, that her closet door upstairs was standing open when I finally went up, and roughly half of what usually hung there was gone. I called my friend Mike around 9 that night, because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Mike had known Rachel and me since before we were married, ran the tire shop 2 doors down from mine, and he came over within 20 minutes without asking a single question on the phone, which told me, later, that something in my voice had already said everything he needed to know. "Who's Marcus?" he asked, once he'd read the note himself, sitting across from me at the same table. I didn't know. That was the specific horror of that first night. Not just that Rachel was gone, but that she'd apparently built an entire second life substantial enough to walk into, and I had never once heard the name attached to it. It took less than a day to find out. Mike, more resourceful than I gave him credit for that week, found Rachel's Instagram, an account I knew existed but never checked, because 12 years in, I'd stopped needing to check anything about my wife, the way you stop checking whether the sun is going to come up. Her most recent posts, dating back nearly 4 months, showed a rooftop dinner in Columbus, a weekend in Chicago, a watch on a man's wrist and a photo where Rachel's hand was resting on his arm, her wedding ring conspicuously absent from the frame. The account belonged to a man named Marcus Reyes. 30 accounts later linked to a tech company he'd founded and sold 2 years earlier for what one article called an 8-figure exit. I sat with my phone in my hand, scrolling through 4 months of a life my wife had apparently been living in plain sight online, a life I'd never once thought to look for, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. I want to be honest about something else, because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was a perfect husband caught by surprise through no fault of my own. Rachel had been saying things for over a year that I'd heard and let slide past me without really absorbing them. Comments about the Hendersons' new boat, about a co-worker's husband who'd taken her to Aruba, about how tired she was of always doing the math on everything we bought. I'd nodded along most of those times, made a joke, changed the subject, because I genuinely believed, and still believe, in some stubborn part of me, that what we had mattered more than any of that. I just never asked her, directly, whether she believed the same thing anymore. 12 years of not asking, it turns out, leaves a lot of room for someone else to start asking instead. That first week, I didn't chase her. I want to be clear that this wasn't strength, not yet. It was closer to shock, the specific paralysis of a man who genuinely didn't know where to direct 12 years of accumulated trust once its object had walked out the door with half a closet and a lawyer already on retainer. Rachel's parents called me twice that week, awkward and apologetic, clearly caught as off guard by all of it as I was, and I told them, honestly, that I didn't understand it either. I didn't know it yet, but the note on the kitchen table wasn't the last thing Rachel would leave behind for me to find, and the next discovery, 3 weeks later, would tell me exactly how long this had actually been going on and how completely I'd missed it. I want to go back further than that October Tuesday, because the truth is this story didn't start with a note against a salt shaker. It started, as far as I can trace it now, almost 2 years earlier, in small comments I heard and let pass through me without really catching hold of anything. Rachel and I met in our early 20s, married at 23, and built what I always considered a solid, unglamorous life together. I ran West Auto Repair, a shop my own father had started, and Rachel worked part-time at a boutique downtown called Willow and Sage, selling clothes to women who could usually afford considerably more than we could. I think now that the job itself, more than anything I ever did or said, planted something in her that took years to fully bloom. The daily, quiet exposure to a version of life just out of reach, folded and displayed on hangers all day long. The comments started small, the way these things always seem to. Around 2 years before the note, Rachel began mentioning, almost in passing, couples she'd read about or seen on Instagram. A woman she followed who posted from a different resort every few months. A local couple, the Hendersons, who'd bought a boat that summer. Must be nice, she'd say, not bitterly, just wistfully. And I'd usually make a joke about how boats were just holes in the water you throw money into, and she'd laugh, and we'd move on. I didn't examine why that particular joke stopped landing quite the way it used to, somewhere in the second year of it. I noticed, though I filed it away instead of really looking at it, that Rachel started buying clothes we couldn't quite justify. Not extravagant, not at first, but enough that I brought it up once, gently, over dinner, and she got defensive in a way that surprised me. I work retail, Michael. I'm allowed to want nice things, she said, and I backed off immediately, because the alternative, pushing further, actually understanding what nice things had come to mean to her, felt like more conflict than our marriage, as far as I understood it, needed. Here's something I noticed and dismissed about a year and a half before the note. Rachel started attending what she called boutique industry events downtown. Evenings, she said, were required for her job. Networking sessions with regional buyers and designers. I never once asked to see an invitation, never questioned why a part-time sales associate needed to attend industry events at all. I trusted the job the way I trusted everything else about her, completely, and without ever revisiting that trust once it had been granted. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever built a life around loving someone so completely that you stopped actually looking at them, the way you stop looking at a picture that's hung on the same wall for a decade, you already understand the particular blindness I'm describing. It isn't stupidity. It's a kind of faith that feels, from the inside, exactly like a strong marriage. By the following spring, about a year before the note, the industry events had become more frequent, and Rachel had started changing her appearance in ways I noticed without connecting to anything. A new hairstyle, more expensive than her usual salon visits. A gym membership at a boutique fitness studio across town. One she said helped with the stress of retail work, standing on her feet all day. I paid for half of it without a second thought, genuinely glad she'd found something that seemed to make her happier, never once asking myself, why happier, seemed to require an entirely new version of herself. She told me, much later, what that spring had actually looked like from where she was standing. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through while I sat across from her, glad she seemed happier. I remember that spring because it was when Marcus first started actually noticing me. Not just the polite, distant interest of a wealthy client at a trunk show, but real attention, questions about my life that felt like they actually mattered to him. I told myself it was flattering and nothing more. I told myself I could enjoy being seen like that without it meaning anything about Michael, about us, about the 12 years I'd already built. I remember standing in my closet before one of those industry events, trying on 3 different outfits, and some small, honest part of me knew exactly who I was actually dressing for, and I put that knowledge away somewhere I didn't have to look at it, the same way I imagine Michael put away every question he could have asked me and didn't. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. That spring, all I saw was a wife who seemed lighter, happier, more herself than she'd been in years, and I was simply grateful for it. By that summer, the pattern had a shape to it, if I'd been willing to trace the shape. Rachel started keeping her phone face down in a way she never used to, angling it away from me on the couch, and once, reaching for the remote, my hand brushed it, and she picked it up so fast I actually flinched. "Reflex," she said, laughing a little too quickly. I laughed too. I didn't ask what the reflex was protecting. There was a night that August I still think about. Rachel came home from an industry event, glowing in a way that seemed, at the time, like genuine happiness. She talked animatedly about a designer she'd met, about opportunities in a completely different world from anything Millbrook could offer. I remember feeling proud of her, thinking she'd finally found something professionally fulfilling after years of a job that mostly paid the bills. I didn't consider, not for a second, that the completely different world she meant might not have anything to do with fashion at all. Our finances became a quiet, recurring point of friction that fall, not dramatic fights, just a low, persistent static. Rachel would make comments about the shop's modest but steady income, about how some people didn't have to think twice before booking a trip, and I'd get defensive in return, reminding her that the shop had put a roof over both our heads for a decade. That stability mattered too. Neither of us ever raised our voices during these conversations. That was, in hindsight, part of the problem. We'd gotten so good at avoiding real conflict that we'd stopped actually resolving anything, just circling the same unspoken resentment every few months and then quietly retreating from it. By that winter, about 8 months before the note, Rachel had started taking weekend trips she described as visits to her college roommate in Columbus, trips that grew from occasional to nearly monthly. I drove her to the bus station for 2 of them. I remember thinking, standing in that parking lot, how strange it was that I felt a small flicker of relief watching her walk toward the terminal, a tired husband's relief at a quiet house for a weekend, rather than anything resembling suspicion. I didn't examine that feeling either. I had a lot of feelings that year I chose not to examine. The trip that actually mattered, though, the one I'd trace everything back to, once I finally had the full picture, was a January weekend, 9 months before the note, when Rachel came home distant in a way I'd never seen before. She barely spoke over dinner that first night back, and later, lying next to me in bed, staring at the ceiling, she said, out of nowhere, "Do you ever think about what our life would look like somewhere else? Somewhere bigger?" I laughed it off, told her Millbrook had always been home, that the shop was here, that I couldn't exactly relocate a business built on regular customers who'd known my father. She didn't laugh with me. She just said, "No, I know. Never mind," and rolled onto her side. And I lay there in the dark next to a woman I thought I knew completely, feeling a small cold draft come through a window I didn't yet know was open. I didn't think about that conversation again until 9 months later, standing at my kitchen counter with a note against a salt shaker. I should have. Looking back now, I think that January conversation was the moment something in Rachel had already been decided, even if the actual leaving took 9 more months to arrive. I didn't understand that at the time. What I understood, in the months that followed, was smaller and stranger, a series of things that individually meant nothing and collectively, I now realize, meant almost everything. It started with a receipt, in February, tucked into a coat pocket I was emptying before a dry cleaning run. A charge from a hotel in Columbus, not the kind of place her college roommate, a schoolteacher with 2 kids, would likely have suggested for a casual weekend visit. $240, one night, a king room. I asked Rachel about it that evening, trying to keep my voice light. She said the roommate's apartment was being fumigated that particular weekend, so they'd split a hotel room instead. It was a plausible answer. I let it go, though I noticed, filing it away without really examining it, that the receipt itemized a single room, not a shared one. Here's another thing I noticed and dismissed that spring. Rachel started using a different phone case, something sleeker and more expensive than anything I'd ever seen her buy for herself. And when I asked about it, she said a friend at the boutique had passed it along, didn't need it anymore. I didn't ask which friend. I'd stopped, somewhere in the last year, asking many follow-up questions at all, because each unasked question felt like a small mercy I was extending to a marriage I still believed, fundamentally, was solid. By March, Rachel had started coming home later from her part-time shifts at Willow and Sage. Not dramatically, 20 or 30 minutes here and there, always with an explanation involving inventory or a difficult customer. I remember calling the boutique once, on a whim, to ask if Rachel wanted me to pick up dinner on my way to get her, and the owner told me, confused, that Rachel's shift had actually ended 2 hours earlier. When I asked Rachel about it that night, she said she'd stopped by a friend's apartment to help with something and lost track of time, forgot to text me. I believed her. It was easier than the alternative. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever felt a specific, low static running under an otherwise ordinary life, nothing you could point to directly, nothing you'd bring to anyone as proof of anything, just a hum you'd gotten so used to you'd nearly stopped hearing it. You already know the particular fog I was walking through that spring. I told myself the static was just marriage settling into its later years. I told myself everyone's marriage had a version of this hum running beneath it. There was a Thursday in April I still think about closely. My friend Mike mentioned, almost in passing, over beers after closing up our respective shops, that his wife had seen Rachel downtown having lunch with a man neither of them recognized, well-dressed, older than us, driving what Mike's wife described as one of those cars you don't see much around here. I asked Rachel about it that evening, as casually as I could manage. She said it was a regional buyer for the boutique, someone she'd been coordinating a spring collection order with over lunch. It made sense on the surface. Boutiques did work with regional buyers. I didn't examine the explanation very hard, because examining it would have required admitting I didn't actually know very much about the daily particulars of Rachel's job at all. She told me, much later, what that same week had actually looked like from her side of things. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through while I sat across from her, accepting an explanation about a regional buyer. I remember that week because it was the week Marcus first told me he loved me. Over that lunch Mike's wife apparently saw us at. And I remember the specific, terrifying relief of hearing it. Relief, because some part of me had spent months waiting for someone to finally say out loud what I'd been unable to admit even to myself, that I wanted more than what Millbrook, what this life, what 12 years of careful budgeting had ever offered me. I told him I needed time. I told myself that meant I hadn't decided anything yet. I drove home that afternoon and lied to Michael about a regional buyer with a steadiness that honestly frightened me, because I realized, sitting across from him at dinner, how easily the lie came out, how little effort it took anymore. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. That Thursday, all I had was a second-hand description of a well-dressed stranger and an explanation about a spring collection that I accepted without a second thought. By May, the behavioral shifts had sharpened into something I could no longer entirely explain away, even with my particular gift for not looking too hard at anything. Rachel started sleeping poorly, and I'd wake at odd hours to find her side of the bed empty, her downstairs at the kitchen table in the dark, phone face down in front of her, not doing anything, just sitting. When I asked if she was okay, she said work stress, and came back to bed rigid, not actually sleeping for a long while after. She also started over-explaining things that didn't need explaining. Why she'd parked at a different meter downtown, why a text notification had made her jump, why she'd needed to reschedule dinner with my mother twice in 1 month. Small things. The kind of things a person only rehearses when they're bracing for a bigger question underneath them, though I didn't understand that particular grammar of behavior yet. The most significant sign that spring, in hindsight, came from Rachel's sister, Denise, who called our house once in June while Rachel was at work and mentioned, casually, chattily, that she was glad Rachel seemed to be figuring things out, with everything going on. I asked what things. There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of someone realizing they've said more than they were supposed to, and Denise recovered fast. Oh, just work stuff? She's mentioned feeling stuck. But the recovery came half a second too late, and I heard it. I didn't push. I told Rachel her sister called. Rachel's face did something complicated for just a moment before she smiled and changed the subject. I didn't think much of it that night. It sat in me anyway, a small hard stone I kept turning over without meaning to, the way you turn over a pebble in your shoe that isn't quite bad enough to stop and remove. By August, 2 months before the note, Rachel told me she was taking a weekend trip to Columbus again, the 4th or 5th that year. I'd lost count by then, for what she called a buying trip tied to the boutique's fall collection. I drove her to the bus station myself. I remember, distinctly, not asking a single follow-up question, because some part of me had started to understand, without fully admitting it, that the fewer questions I asked, the fewer answers I'd eventually have to sit with. That same week, my mother mentioned, over Sunday dinner, that she'd run into Rachel downtown on a weekday afternoon when Rachel was supposedly at the boutique, and Rachel had seemed startled to see her, cutting their conversation shorter than usual. I filed that away too. By October, when the note finally appeared against the salt shaker, I had accumulated an entire year's worth of small stones in my pocket, and I still hadn't once set them all down on a table and actually looked at the shape they made together. I understand now, looking back, that Rachel had likely already made her decision well before that January conversation about somewhere bigger, that the entire year that followed was less a slow unraveling and more a woman quietly, methodically building an exit she'd already chosen, one industry event and one buying trip at a time, while I stood beside her the whole time, trusting the frame of our marriage so completely that I never once checked whether the wall behind it was still standing. There was no confrontation to prepare for. Rachel had already made that decision for both of us, walked out with half a closet and a lawyer on retainer, and left me standing in a kitchen with a note against a salt shaker and absolutely nothing left to strategize toward. What followed instead, over the 3 weeks after she left, wasn't proof gathering in service of a plan. It was simply the slow, methodical process of understanding exactly what had already happened to my life, piece by piece, after the fact. The Instagram discovery came first, that same week, through Mike. But it was 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning I'd spent going through the filing cabinet in our home office looking for a car title Rachel would need for the divorce paperwork, that I found the second thing, a folder tucked behind our tax documents, unlabeled, containing printed emails between Rachel and a real estate agent in Columbus, dated back nearly 8 months, discussing properties in a price range that made my chest go tight just looking at the numbers. 4-bedroom homes. A waterfront condo. None of them anywhere near Millbrook. I sat on the floor of that office for a long time with that folder in my lap. 8 months. The January conversation about somewhere bigger hadn't been a passing thought. It had been the opening line of an actual plan, one she'd been quietly building alongside a life she was still, every night, coming home to share with me. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is the moment that actually mattered most in the entire process of understanding what had happened, more than the Instagram photos, more than anything I'd find afterward. Sitting alone on that office floor, I understood for the first time that this hadn't been a sudden temptation Rachel had stumbled into and panicked about too late. It had been managed, deliberately, over the better part of a year, while I sat across the dinner table from her every night, asking almost nothing, assuming everything was fine, because assuming was so much easier than actually looking. My friend Mike came by that Saturday afternoon, and I showed him the folder. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he told me something I hadn't known, that his wife had actually run into Rachel at a coffee shop in Columbus back in the spring, sitting across from a man matching Marcus's description, and hadn't said anything to me at the time because she wasn't certain it meant what it looked like, and didn't want to cause trouble over something that might have an innocent explanation. I understood, hearing that, exactly how many people around me had likely seen fragments of this over the past year, and, like me, had each individually decided the fragment they'd seen wasn't quite enough to act on. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable here, because this story doesn't work if I let myself off the hook entirely. In the days after finding that folder, I made a decision I'm not proud of. I called Rachel's sister Denise and pushed her, harder than I'd ever pushed anyone in my life, to tell me exactly how long she'd known, exactly what she'd known, using a tone I didn't recognize in my own voice. Denise cried on the phone. She told me she'd found out only a few weeks before Rachel left, that she'd begged Rachel to at least tell me herself rather than leaving a note, and Rachel had refused. I apologized to Denise the next day, once the anger had drained out of me enough to hear myself clearly. It was a small, ugly moment I'm not proud of, but it belongs in this story because it's the truth of what grief and betrayal did to me for about 48 hours that week. The following Monday, I received a call from my own attorney, a measured, practical man named Walsh who Mike had recommended, confirming that Rachel's lawyer had formally filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and requesting an unusually fast timeline given that, as her filing put it, the parties have no shared children and minimal shared assets requiring negotiation. I remember reading that phrase, minimal shared assets, and feeling something that wasn't quite anger, closer to a strange, hollow amusement, 12 years reduced, on paper, to a phrase about how little there was left to fight over. She told me, much later, what those first weeks after leaving had actually looked like from her side, once the reality of what she'd done had time to settle. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living through while I sat on an office floor with a folder in my lap. I remember standing in Marcus's kitchen, an actual kitchen island made of some kind of imported stone, bigger than my entire bedroom back home, about 10 days after I'd left, and feeling a specific, unexpected panic that had nothing to do with Michael at all. Marcus had started, almost immediately, commenting on how I loaded the dishwasher, on what I wore to a dinner with his business partners, on how I should probably work with someone to polish how I spoke in certain company. I told myself it was just an adjustment period, that any new relationship required some accommodation. I remember standing at that enormous window looking out over a view I'd once thought I wanted more than almost anything, and feeling, for the first time since leaving, a cold thread of doubt I didn't yet have language for. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. That week, all I had was a lawyer's phone call and a phrase about minimal shared assets that I couldn't stop turning over in my head. I want to be clear that I never went looking for information about Rachel's new life beyond what landed in front of me unasked. I didn't check her Instagram again after that first week. I didn't ask Mike's wife for updates. Part of that was self-protection, I'll admit, some instinct telling me that watching would only prolong something I needed to let close on its own. But part of it, I think, was the beginning of something steadier taking shape in me, the first quiet decision in this whole ordeal that I actually made on purpose rather than simply absorbing. The divorce proceedings moved with the speed Rachel's filing had requested. I didn't contest anything. Walsh advised me, at one point, that given the minimal shared assets and the clear documentation of when Rachel's outside relationship had begun, I likely had grounds to pursue something more adversarial if I wanted to. I told him I didn't want to. I wanted it over, cleanly, without turning 12 years into a courtroom battle over furniture and a modest savings account. He respected that, though I could tell it surprised him. The divorce finalized in early December, 7 weeks after the note first appeared against the salt shaker. I signed the papers in Walsh's office on a gray Tuesday morning, and I remember driving back to the shop afterward and simply opening for the day because I'd learned, over those 7 weeks, that the ordinary continuation of small, useful tasks was the only thing that actually helped. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that office signing away 12 years in under 20 minutes. But the story wasn't actually finished, and 8 months later, on an entirely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Rachel would be standing on my porch again, asking for something I never expected to have to answer. 8 months after I signed the divorce papers, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early August, I looked up from a transmission I was rebuilding at the shop and saw Rachel standing just inside the open bay door, and for a moment I genuinely thought I was imagining her. She looked different, thinner in a way that didn't look healthy, dressed simpler than I remembered from her Instagram photos. No watch on her wrist, no ring on her finger, just Rachel, standing there in the smell of motor oil and metal shavings, looking smaller than the version of her I'd built up in my head over 8 months of not looking for her. Michael. Her voice cracked on the single syllable of my name. Can we talk? Please. Just for a few minutes. I set down my wrench and wiped my hands on a shop rag, mostly because I needed something to do with them while I decided what I actually wanted to say. I'm working, Rachel. I know. I drove 2 hours. Please. 5 minutes. I walked her to the small break room in the back of the shop rather than out front where any customer could wander past and recognize her, not out of kindness toward her exactly, but because some old habit of privacy toward things that concern the two of us still ran deeper than I expected it to. She sat down across the folding table from me, hands wrapped around a paper cup of the shop's terrible coffee that she'd accepted without seeming to actually want it. Marcus and I broke up 4 months ago, she said, before I'd asked her anything. I should have told you that a long time ago, but I didn't know how, and I wasn't sure you'd even want to hear from me. Okay, I said. I kept my voice level, which took more effort than I expected it to. Why are you here, Rachel? She was quiet for a moment, staring down at the coffee cup. Because I made the worst mistake of my life, and I think some part of me has known that since almost the first month I was there, and I've spent the last 8 months trying to figure out if there was any version of coming back here that wasn't completely selfish and unfair to ask of you. I don't think there is. I'm asking anyway. Tell me, I said. All of it. If you're going to ask me for something, I want to hear the whole thing first. She nodded, and something in her seemed to give way, the careful composure she'd walked in with finally cracking open into something raw. It started so much smaller than it probably looked from the outside, she said. The first time I actually talked to Marcus, really talked, not just at some trunk show event. It wasn't romantic at all. It was almost 2 years ago now. He was a client at the boutique, and he asked me a question about my own life that felt like nobody had asked me in years. Not what I did, but whether I actually liked doing it. And I remember standing there in that stupid, beautiful store, surrounded by clothes I could never afford, and just talking to him for 20 minutes about things I hadn't said out loud to anyone, including you, in longer than I want to admit. I told myself that was harmless. One conversation. I told myself I was allowed to have someone notice me like that without it meaning anything about us, about our marriage, about the life we'd built. That's the lie I kept telling myself for months. Michael, smaller and smaller versions of the same sentence. Every single time I let it go one step further. It's just lunch. It's just a phone call. It's just an industry event I genuinely need to attend for work. I got so good at believing those smaller words that I actually did believe them, most days. By the time it became something physical, I'd already spent almost a year building a version of myself in my own head that didn't belong in Millbrook anymore. Someone who deserved bigger rooms, better views, a life where I didn't have to think twice about a hotel room or a dress. And I need you to understand, because I think it matters, that it was never really about you not being enough. It was about me feeling like I'd stopped being anyone interesting at all, somewhere in the last few years, and Marcus made me feel, for a while, like I still surprised somebody. I know how that sounds. I know it doesn't excuse a single thing I did. The fear started almost right away, and it never really left. I was terrified of you finding a receipt, of Denise slipping up, of my mother running into me on some weekday afternoon I was supposed to be at the boutique. I started rehearsing explanations before I even needed them, Michael. I'd stand in front of the mirror some mornings, practicing what I'd say if you asked a certain question, and I am so ashamed of that specific detail that I became a person who rehearsed lies to her own husband while getting dressed for the day. I planned the ending for months before I actually did it. The lawyer, the note, the timing. I told myself I was being kind, doing it cleanly, not dragging it out into some ugly scene. I understand now that leaving a note against a salt shaker instead of looking at you was its own kind of cruelty, maybe worse than the affair itself in some ways, because at least the affair I could tell myself was about something I needed. The note was just cowardice. Marcus started changing almost as soon as I moved in. Small things at first, comments about how I loaded a dishwasher, what I wore to his business dinners, whether I should work with someone on how I talked in certain rooms. It took me embarrassingly long to understand that I'd traded one kind of quiet unhappiness for a much louder, much more humiliating version of the same thing. He ended it in April, over text, while I was standing in an apartment that technically had my name on the lease for exactly 6 more weeks. She stopped there, breathing unevenly, and reached one hand halfway across the folding table toward mine before seeming to think better of it and pulling it back. Michael, I know I don't deserve to ask you this. I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anything left to lose by asking, and some part of me still believes what we had was real, even with everything I did to it. Is there any version of this where you'd consider, where there's still a door open, even a small one? I sat with that question longer than I think she expected me to. Not because I was uncertain of my answer, but because I wanted to make sure, before I said it, that what came out of my mouth was actually the truth, and not just anger wearing the truth's clothes. "Thank you for telling me all of it," I said finally. "I mean that. I think you needed to say it as much as I needed to hear it." I stood up from the folding table. "But no, Rachel, there's no door. I'm not angry enough right now to want to punish you, and I'm not still in love with you enough to want to rescue you. I just don't want this anymore. Any of it." Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue, didn't beg the way some part of me had braced for. "Okay," she said quietly. "I think I knew that before I drove here. I think I needed to hear it out loud anyway." I walked her back out through the shop, past the transmission I'd left half assembled, and she paused at her car in the parking lot, keys in hand. "For what it's worth," she said, "you were never the problem, Michael. I hope you know that." "I know," I said, and for the first time in 8 months, I found I actually meant it without any bitterness underneath the words at all. I finished the transmission that afternoon, after Rachel drove away, because that's what the day still required of me, and because I'd learned, over the past 10 months, that the ordinary continuation of small, useful tasks was still the only thing that actually helped when something large had just moved through a room. Rachel didn't reach out again after that Tuesday. I heard, through Denise about 2 months later, that she'd moved back to a smaller apartment in Columbus, taken a job at a department store, was slowly, quietly rebuilding something modest out of what remained. I didn't ask for more detail than that, and Denise, to her credit, didn't offer it unprompted. There was no dramatic downfall to report, no public humiliation I could point to as proof the universe had balanced its books. Just an ordinary woman, working an ordinary job, living a life considerably smaller than the one she'd once left 12 years for. I learned, separately, that Marcus had gone on to a similar pattern with someone else entirely, a woman half his age he'd met through some networking event within months of Rachel's departure. Mike mentioned it once, almost apologetically, like he wasn't sure I'd want to know, and I told him honestly that I felt nothing at all hearing it. Not vindication, not anger, just a kind of distant, settled indifference toward a man whose entire presence in my life had lasted less than a year and had never once required me to actually understand him as a person. I want to stop here for a second, because there's a specific realization that arrived for me sometime that autumn, working alone in the shop on a slow afternoon, that I hadn't expected. I'd spent months bracing for some large, cinematic moment of closure, a final confrontation, a court date, something that would announce, clearly, that the worst of it was over. It never really arrived as a single moment. It arrived instead as an absence, the specific, quiet discovery that I'd stopped waking up at 3 in the morning running through the same year of small, unasked questions, stopped flinching slightly whenever Denise's number came up on my phone. Denise and I actually stayed close, in the strange way these things sometimes work out. She'd apologized to me, more than once, for not saying something sooner, and I told her, honestly, that I understood the position she'd been in, caught between loyalty to a sister and honesty toward a brother-in-law she genuinely cared about. She started coming to the shop occasionally, bringing her kids by to see the tools, and somewhere in that ordinary continuation of family, something steadier than before took root between us. I sold the house the following spring, not out of any dramatic need to erase Rachel from the physical record of my life, but because it had become, over 18 months, simply too large for one person, and because I found, walking through it those last few weeks before the sale, that I no longer felt the specific weight I'd expected to feel in certain rooms. The kitchen, where the note had once sat against a salt shaker, had become, by then, just a kitchen again. I bought a smaller place closer to the shop, put in the kind of garden Rachel had always found boring and low ambition, tomatoes and basil in raised beds along a south-facing fence, and found, to my own quiet surprise, that I liked tending something small and unglamorous far more than I'd ever let myself admit while married to someone who measured a life by its square footage. There's a phrase Rachel used, that afternoon in the break room, that I've turned over more than a few times since. I stopped being anyone interesting at all. I understand now that whatever she meant by that had very little to do with me, or with Millbrook, or with the shop my father built and I kept running. Some people go looking for a bigger room and discover, eventually, that the room was never actually the problem. I don't know if Rachel has found her way to that understanding yet, wherever she is now. I hope, honestly, that she does, someday, for her own sake more than mine. I could have spent the last year and a half angry, letting the note and the folder of real estate emails and the 8 months of small, unasked questions become the entire architecture of everything that came after. I chose something else instead, somewhere in that quiet realization, working alone in the shop that autumn afternoon. That was the only real victory in any of this, not the fact that she came back and I said no, but simply refusing to let any of it keep managing my life the way it had managed those last months before she left. I started sleeping through the night again sometime that winter, which took longer to come back than I expected, and I noticed it the way you notice a headache has finally lifted. Not all at once, just a gradual absence of something you'd stopped registering as pain because it had been there so long. I recognized myself again somewhere in that stretch of ordinary, unremarkable months, quieter than before, steadier, considerably less willing to mistake not asking questions for the same thing as trust. That's my story. A note against a salt shaker, a folder behind the tax documents, a paper cup of shop coffee she never actually wanted to drink. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this hit close to home, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I'd genuinely love to hear your own story too. See you in the next one. What's hardest to sit with, looking back, is how much of what happened to my marriage had nothing at all to do with Rachel's character and everything to do with two people who'd both stopped asking each other real questions years before either of us noticed the silence. I built my entire adult life on the assumption that a strong marriage required minimal maintenance once established, set the foundation once, then simply trust it indefinitely. Rachel, meanwhile, was quietly starving for exactly the kind of attention I'd stopped offering her, not because I didn't love her, but because I'd confused steadiness with sufficiency. Her return, and my answer to it, reveals something worth sitting with too, that forgiveness and reconciliation aren't actually the same decision, even though we often talk about them as if they are. I forgave Rachel, in the sense that I no longer carried active anger toward her by the time she showed up at the shop. But forgiveness didn't obligate me to rebuild something that had already shown me, conclusively, how thin its foundation had become. Those are two separate acts of the heart, and conflating them is often what keeps people trapped in reconciliations neither person actually wants. The story's real turning point wasn't the note, or even Rachel's confession in the break room. It was the folder behind the tax documents. The moment I understood that what happened to us hadn't been a sudden lapse, but a year-long, deliberate construction. That distinction matters, because it reframes the entire question of blame. Rachel didn't stumble into betrayal. She built an exit, patiently, while I stood beside her trusting a wall I never once checked for cracks.